In the final weeks of her life, Aretha Franklin often sat in a small, dimly lit room at her Detroit home, surrounded by photographs that had yellowed at the edges. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting long, soft shadows across the piano she could no longer play. Her breath had grown shallow, her voice faint, but her eyes, those legendary burning eyes, still carried a depth that could silence an entire world. On one of those quiet afternoons, with her family gathered just outside the door, she whispered something, just a few fragile words, into the ear of a person she trusted most. Words that were never meant for the public, words that carried a lifetime of glory, regret, fear, and prayer. No one in the hallway heard what she said, but decades of music paused for that brief moment, as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. Those were the words Aretha left behind. A final wish, a final request, a truth that, once revealed, would haunt millions. Before we begin the journey through her life, her rise, her pain, and the secret she carried to the very end, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you can join us as we explore the stories that remind us how fragile, beautiful, and painfully human even the greatest legends can be. Born in Memphis in 1942, Aretha Franklin grew up in a world shaped by gospel hymns, kitchen table prayers, and a voice that God seemed to carve directly into her soul. To understand the weight Aretha carried in her final days, we must return to the beginning, to the house where her voice was born and where her first wounds were carved into her spirit. Aretha Louise Franklin grew up in a home filled with music, yet shadowed by turbulence. Her father, the charismatic Reverend C.L. Franklin, was a magnetic force, a preacher whose sermons stirred entire congregations, a man whose voice could lift the broken. But behind the pulpit's glow, the Franklin household carried storms that a young girl could never fully name. At just 6 years old, Aretha felt the first sting of loss when her mother, Barbara, left the family home. Though Barbara would visit, her presence came in flickers, a gentle voice on the phone, a brief touch, a hug that always ended too soon. For Aretha, absence became a familiar ache, and when her mother died unexpectedly only a few years later, that ache deepened into a silence she carried for the rest of her life. Music became her refuge. Late at night, she would sit near the piano, listening to her father rehearse powerful sermons or visiting gospel greats pour their hearts into the keys. She mimicked every note, every breath, until the house itself seemed to tremble with the sound of a little girl learning how to survive through song. But even as her voice blossomed, her childhood was far from innocent. By the age of 12, she became a young mother, twice before she turned 15. The world outside would never fully understand the pain embedded in those early years. But Aretha carried it quietly, pressing it deep into the very voice that would one day move nations. Her gospel roots were her anchor, but they were also the reminder of everything she had lost before she ever stepped onto a real stage. And in those struggles, loneliness, pressure, abandonment, the seeds of her extraordinary strength were planted. But she had no idea then that the very fire that lifted her up would later threaten to consume her. As Aretha moved into her teenage years, the world began to take notice of the quiet girl with the thunderous voice. Her father, recognizing the power she possessed, took her on gospel tours across the country. Night after night, audiences rose to their feet as her voice, raw, aching, impossible to ignore, filled churches, concert halls, and small auditoriums from Detroit to Chicago. But gospel was only the beginning. Aretha hungered for more, not for fame, but for freedom. Freedom to define her own sound, her own womanhood, her own life beyond the shadows of the pulpit. At 18, she signed with Columbia Records. And although those early jazz-inspired records didn't quite capture her essence, they shaped her into the artist she was destined to be. Everything changed in 1967. The moment she walked into the studio to record Respect, the world shifted. The opening notes were electric. Her voice was no longer just powerful. It was revolutionary. It carried the weight of every wound she had endured, fused with the fierce confidence she had fought to claim. The song became an anthem, not just for women, not just for Black America, but for anyone who had ever demanded to be seen, valued, respected. From that point, Aretha wasn't just a singer, She was the queen of soul. The stage became her kingdom. Her music, Natural Woman, Chain of Fools, Ain't No Way, Think, became the soundtrack of a generation. Audiences worshipped her, critics praised her, presidents honored her. Her voice shook the walls of history itself. But beneath the spotlight's glow, there were cracks forming. Pressure from her career, emotional exhaustion, a series of painful relationships, and the relentless expectation to remain flawless. Fame had given her a crown, but it had also built a cage. And behind the applause, a quieter story was unfolding, one that would lead to the longest and darkest battle of her life. As the years passed and the spotlight continued to follow her, Aretha began facing battles the public never truly saw. Behind the commanding stage presence and the unmistakable voice, her body was fighting a quiet, relentless war. Fatigue crept in first, a heaviness she couldn't explain. Some days the piano keys felt colder, heavier. Her breath didn't stretch as far as it used to. Then came the hospital visits, soft murmurs in white hallways, doctors speaking gently but never gently enough. Aretha had always been intensely private, guarding her personal life like a fortress. Illness was no exception. For years, she hid her struggle from the world, revealing only fragments, just enough to calm rumors, never enough to expose her vulnerability. Closer to her, though, her family saw the truth. They saw the pain that forced her to cancel tours. They saw the trembling in her hands when she tried to lift a teacup. They saw how the woman who once commanded stages with ease now occasionally needed help just walking across a room. Yet Aretha fought on. With every breath she still had, she clung to music. There were nights when she would sit at her piano, pressing a single note again and again, as if trying to remind her body of the strength it once knew. Sometimes she sang softly, whispers of melodies she never released, lullabies for herself, echoes of a life lived at full volume. And during those years, one person remained a constant presence, her longtime friend, confidant, and collaborator, Clive Davis. He visited her quietly, always respecting her need for privacy, always believing she would return to the stage once more. She wanted to believe it too, but the truth was beginning to settle around her like a slow-moving storm. Her body was growing weaker, and the illness, pancreatic cancer, was tightening its grip. She told almost no one. Instead, she carried her diagnosis the same way she carried her pain as a child, silently, stoically, alone. And then, the final weeks arrived. The weeks when secrets surface, when old memories return, and when even a queen must face the truth she spent a lifetime trying to outrun. A few weeks before her passing, Aretha Franklin returned to the home where she felt safest, her Detroit residence filled with memories of gospel mornings, family laughter, and the echoes of songs that had shaped the world. The house grew quieter each day, the corridors softer, as though they, too, understood that time was slipping through the edges of the walls. Her family gathered close, her sons, her nieces, her closest friends. They took turns sitting beside her, holding her hand, telling stories that made her smile even when her body was too weak for laughter. The woman who once commanded global stages now spent her afternoons wrapped in a warm blanket, listening to faint recordings of her own gospel roots. Her strength faded, but her mind remained clear. She asked for certain people, old friends, trusted voices, the ones who had seen her not as a legend, but as a woman. Among them was her longtime assistant and confidant, Fanny. She was the one Aretha whispered to most often in those days, the one who patiently leaned in as Aretha spoke in soft, trembling breaths. One quiet afternoon, with sunlight filtering through half-drawn curtains, Aretha asked everyone to leave the room except for Fanny. Her voice was faint, but her eyes were steady, steady in a way that told Fanny this moment mattered. She spoke slowly, fighting for breath, yet every word carried weight. What she said was not a grand revelation or a public statement. It was intimate, heartbreakingly simple, and deeply human. Aretha expressed her final wish, that her family stay united, no matter the fame, the money, the legacy, or the battles that might follow her absence. She feared the fractures that so often followed a great artist's death. She feared her children drifting apart. She feared her legacy becoming a battlefield. "Make sure they stay together," she murmured. "Make sure they love each other when I'm gone." Those were the words that would haunt millions, not because they were dramatic, but because they revealed the truth behind the crown. A queen's final request wasn't about her music, her estate, or her legacy. It was about family, about love, about the one thing she spent her whole life searching for. Hours grew shorter, nights became quieter, and on the final morning, surrounded by the voices she cherished most, Aretha Franklin took her last breath as soft gospel music played in the background, returning her to the sound that had carried her from childhood to eternity. When the light in the room dimmed, the world didn't just lose a legend. It lost a mother, a daughter, a sister, and a soul who had given everything she had, even her final words. When word of Aretha Franklin's passing spread across the world, it felt as though an entire generation paused. Vigils formed outside her Detroit home. Churches rang bells in her honor. Radios across America played "Respect" on repeat, as if trying to hold on to the echo of her voice for just a little longer. Her funeral was not simply a farewell, it was a cultural moment. Presidents, musicians, spiritual leaders, and thousands of fans filled the Greater Grace Temple. Pink Cadillacs lined the streets, a tribute to one of her most iconic songs. Inside, the air trembled with gospel hymns, the same hymns that shaped her as a girl. People cried, people sang, people lifted their hands to the sky. It was grief and gratitude intertwined. Aretha left behind an estate valued in the tens of millions, including her cherished manuscripts, unreleased recordings, and the rights to her vast musical catalog. But the material wealth, impressive as it was, paled in comparison to her true legacy. The way her voice became the soundtrack of civil rights marches, broken hearts, Sunday mornings, and moments of triumph. Her songs still echo through cafes, churches, wedding halls, and quiet apartments lit only by a single lamp. Young artists still study her phrasing, her fire, her impossible control, and her message of dignity, power, resilience has never faded. Those who knew her speak of her generosity, her humor, her fierce loyalty. Those who never met her feel as if they lost someone who had once spoken directly to their spirit. In the end, what remains is simple: a voice that changed music, a woman who changed people, and a question that lingers long after the final note fades. When the spotlight disappears, what do we truly leave behind? And who will remember the last words we ever speak? If you believe music can outlive even the greatest pain, leave a heart below for the Queen of Soul,